Let's talk about happiness in a little bit more depth, because we touched on the hedonists earlier, and the Greek hedonists, they sought pleasure and they wanted the exclusion of pain. And we all know hedonistic people. And I suspect that most hedonists, true hedonists that we know, are not happy. Yesterday I spoke to an English professor of philosophy, A.C. Grayling, and he talked to me about the idea that, and we basically know this, that the one thing that you shouldn't be doing, well, many things you shouldn't be doing in this context, but the one thing you shouldn't be doing if you want to be happy is to try to be happy.
Yeah.
And it's something you touch on in the book as well.
Yeah.
Explain why that is, and try and help us to get around that, because given that we all secretly really do want to be happy, how do we trick ourselves into not trying to be happy in the process of trying to be happy?
A friend of mine, Ed Slingerland, wrote a book called Trying Not to Try, basically drawing on ancient Chinese philosophy, which is the question, there are some things like acting cool where you want to do it, but if you try to act cool, it wrecks the whole thing. And happiness is certainly one of them. So Grayling is right. He's right on sort of empirical scientific grounds. There's tons of studies where you ask people, how important is being happy to you? How much of your life do you spend trying to be happy? And then you ask them, how happy are you? Are you depressed? Are you anxious? And you find that the people who spend most of their time trying to be happy are an N worse off. And and that's a correlational study. You can think of different ways of talking about it, but you can also tell people, I want you to spend the next day really working on being happy. And then I check in with you and you're not so happy. I think the advice here is to seek greater goods, like, enduring relationships, projects, and so on. And for one thing, that's satisfying in its own right. Maybe your time at the gym or your time bird watching is not happy in any simple sense, but it's rewarding. And also, I think happiness will come along the way. So I'm a pluralist. I think seeking happiness is one thing, pleasure is one thing, meaning is another thing, but they are related. So when you ask people, how much meaning do you have in your life and how much happiness do you have in your life, the answers are actually correlated. Yeah, there are people who are high in one and zero in the other, but many people have both.
I don't want to stray too far into the negative elements of mental health, because neither of us, as far as I know, are medical health doctors or professionals. It just on a very, very superficial level, it is interesting that we can use, I believe, pain and indeed self-harm as a sort of negative coping mechanism.
Yeah.
That we then need to get help with.
Yeah.
And so the use of pain as appearing to be pleasurable or appearing to ameliorate or alleviate some other pain can be very damaging. I think, just for example of my own OCD, I might get obsessive about something, and then my compulsive behavior, which is a reaction to that obsessiveness, can be damaging.
Yeah. I think there are definitely such cases. I talk about the role of suffering and pain as, part of pleasure and part of the good life, but there are definitely ways it could go awry. And one is self-harm, or just non-suicidal self-injury, where the person, maybe often adolescent, might cut themselves, and they aren't trying to kill themselves, but they do have a sort of desire for pain, for marking their bodies. And there are a host of different theories of this. One theory is it's a cry for help, a signal, I'm in need here. Nobody's listening to me. I'm going to show you how serious I am. It could be to some extent self-punishment. So sometimes people, carve into their bodies words like loser or disgusting, as if, they hate themselves and trying to damage themselves. I think one theory which has a lot of weight to it and connects to kind of your examples is pain can often distract you from anxiety and neuroses. So, and this shows up in the sort of unhealthy sort of pain. It also shows up in more acceptable kind of pain, like athletic training, where sometimes somebody who's too much in their head might go for a long, hard run.
Tell us, just a little bit, if you would, about struggle. And I know we've talked about it in the obvious ways in terms of climbing mountains and the struggle one might go through to get good grades, and therefore the proportional, sometimes disproportionate satisfaction or indeed disappointment if you don't get what you want. But more widely, how, in your view, does struggle relate to happiness or relate to pleasure? And let's not forget either that pleasure and happiness are not necessarily one and the same thing.
They aren't. And happiness isn't a singular thing either. Sometimes people say happiness, they just mean the sum total of your experience. Sometimes people mean, when I ask you, how happy are you? And you tell me to answer. And those are not one and the same. It gets, one of them correlates with money in a different way than another one, for instance. If I could have put more words into my title, struggle would have been one of them. For the most part, when I talk about suffering, I often don't mean pain. I mean difficulty, struggle, barriers to overcome. And I think we're wired up so that has tremendous value to us. Finding a goal, trying to attain it over a significant period of time is it's what we want to see when we watch a movie or TV show or book. It's screenwriting 101. Present an obstacle. It could be the cutest obstacle. It could be a deadly serious obstacle. Present an obstacle, but we like it in our fictions because we like it in our life. If people who go through lives with no obstacle, no struggle, run the risk of boredom and ennui and dissatisfaction. And there's kind of a paradox here, which is just again is what you go to. Which when I train for a marathon, say I want to run a marathon, I say I don't look forward to failing. And I don't want to have blisters. I want everything to go well. But at the same time, if I didn't have struggle, if it wasn't difficult, it wouldn't be unsatisfying.
And is there a sense, do you think, in some people, psychologically, that if they live, let's put it bluntly, run-of-the-mill lives, or lives that they consider to be run-of-the-mill, or they have a 9-to-5 job, that they might be predisposed or more predisposed to look for a different or an unconventional type of pleasure compared to someone who is a rock climber by trade or is a professional sportsman who's used to the highs and lows. I'm thinking, just for example, and I don't want to sort of be explicit here, but if we talk, for example, about sadomasochism, or talk about sexual relationships where one partner really wants to be dominated, not in a dangerous way, but in that sort of relation. Sometimes you might find that person in everyday life to be very different to what they are expecting in the bedroom.
Some phrase, geek in the streets, freak in the sheets, or something. I don't know if that translates. What you're saying makes total sense. I'll be honest, which is I've looked to try to find that relationship. So one way of putting it is, when your life is full of comfort and boredom, you will seek out extreme stimulation otherwise. This also makes the prediction that you'd find more of this BDSM, spicy foods, religious ritual in wealthy countries, where often people are not worried about their day-to-day survival, than in extremely poor countries, where you think they have enough to worry about, enough real suffering to worry about. You would predict it. As far as I know, there's no evidence for it. I mean, I'd love to say you're right because it makes sense to me, but I've never seen good evidence for it. And I got to say, just, if there are any doctoral students out there looking for a project, the question of who likes suffering and who doesn't, and what kind, why do I like horror movies and you like spicy foods? We are at a loss. Predicting it is, everybody has some taste for benign masochism, for difficulty, for struggle. But the extent of it and why we want it in different flavors, I think is just a mystery.
Explain to those who haven't read the book yet why you use the term secret poison.
Secret poison? I don't remember myself. Give me a hint.
No, sorry, I don't know whether you heard properly. Sweet poison.
Oh, it's a line from Keats, right? About his love, and there's also his love for death.
Sorry, can you hear me? Because my internet is not brilliant.
You were talking about sweet poison?
Sweet poison, yes.
I think it's from a line from the poet Keats in A Love Letter, where he talks about, I can't quote it, people should Google it, but it expressed a particularly mordant view about wanting either like a kiss from her lips or death. And it presents a certain poetic view towards suffering, which I sort of talk about at the end.
What can we learn from Aldous Huxley in terms of pleasure and pain?
So Aldous Huxley, and this is how I end my book. So this is, I want people to buy it, but if not, we've heard the whole thing from beginning to end, which is, in Brave New Worlds, it's a dystopian fiction where everyone's happy mostly because of drugs, because of chemical drugs that gives them sort of exuberance, and also behavioral techniques. And Huxley imagines a savage who rejects this and is arguing with a representative of the establishment. And a representative says, we can make you happy, we can give you comfort. And the person who I think is speaking with Huxley's voice says, there's more to life than that. I don't want comfort. I want sin. I want adventure. I want danger. I want trouble. And that's, I think that captures a real insight about human nature that Huxley was well aware of.
Before we go to audience questions, and do send in questions if you have them, I'm just curious myself as to what you found most surprising or enlightening about the research you did for this book, because you draw on other authors, you have your own thoughts, your own theories, you try to lean on some of the science and some of the psychological research. What kind of made you sit up and go, wow, that's really interesting?
Something a lot. I mean, it was so much fun to read the research of other people. Studies about how if I make you think of something you're ashamed of, you're more likely to shock yourself later. Studies of how communities of people who suffer together then become closer, and you do this in the laboratory. The thing which moved me, which is something we mentioned before, and I've sort of been mulling this over, it's the finding of Csikszentmihalyi, which is that although people recognize the value of flow, the value of falling into a state, so many of them never attain it. And he was writing this a while ago, I think 20 years ago, maybe 25 years ago. And right now, there are so many temptations in the world, particularly over the internet, that it makes it harder and harder to get the right sort of suffering, the right sort of struggle, the right sort of effort, the right sort of flow. So I think reading this book made me truly appreciate the bind that modern people are in, where it's like there's a war against the good life in that way.
I think it's fascinating, by the way, we talked about that extreme practice in the Philippines of people being nailed to the cross. But in the Western tradition of Christianity, suffering, sacrifice, and you do a whole chapter on sacrifice, of course, is absolutely at the heart of it, isn't it?
Yes, yes. And then don't get me started on Buddhism, which
just a little bit on Buddhism.
Well, people I know who know this much more than me will tell you that the Four Noble Truths, the tenets of it, involve an appreciation of the inescapability of suffering, the impermanence of everything you value, the fragility of everything you hold to. And the idea is that only through really appreciating this are you ever going to make any sort of mental or spiritual progress. The idea that happiness and pleasure could be an attainable goal, one worth attaining, is, my understanding, is entirely anathema, both to Christianity and also Buddhism and probably other religious traditions I haven't looked at.
It's interesting that even those of us who are in a basically happy state, and there may be fewer of us than we imagine, that word vulnerability, that fragility that you used, at any moment something painful, unchosen, might happen. I wonder whether there's any sense in which, by building in a bit more deliberate risk, chosen risk, or deliberate pain of some sort in a safe way. I don't mean don't mean, certainly not in a criminal way or in a self-harming way. But I wonder whether that is, you know, some form of an attempt to control our own fate, that we don't want to be too happy. That's why we touch wood. We don't want to be too happy, because otherwise we're more vulnerable.
It tempts fate, is a way of putting it. And there's some evidence that there's one study where you give people a list of 32 bad things that could happen in your life, and some people, and see how many to tick off. And some people, oh my God, they tick off all 32, and oh my God, it's horrible. But some people tick off nothing. No, none of it ever happened. And then you check their pain tolerance and their tendency to catastrophize, and what you find is a sort of a U-shaped curve, where the people, an inverted U actually, the people with the highest pain tolerance are the people in the middle. If you've had a life of suffering and pain, it weakens you. You know, Nietzsche was wrong. You know, sometimes what doesn't kill you weakens you. But also the people who made it through life unscathed, and this fits with your insight, they also have low pain tolerance. It's like they've never been tested, they've never been tried.
So there's a sense in which that we can, by having been through difficult experiences, we become more resilient. We can endure better, and there are these examples of post-traumatic growth, as you say.
Yes. So I'm somewhat skeptical. I think these examples tend to be overblown, but the right sort of suffering, particularly right sort of chosen suffering, I think can be beneficial. I also think that in some way, just to get fatalistic about it, you know, I talk about having children and the pros and cons of that, and how it might be good for one kind of life and bad for another kind of life. But I quote Zadie Smith at length, and she just talks about the tremendous risk you have when you have a child, and you love a child. The possibility of agony, worry to lose that child, and I think that nicely captures the fact that the pursuits in life that we value the most also carry the most risk of pain.
Well, you ask us in the book to imagine a scenario in which we're told that we can have a children within this time span, but the child will be ill or fatally ill, or we can wait. And some people, you think, would still go for that first option.
Or imagine a case, the case I imagine is from a MIT philosopher, is that suppose for one reason something goes awry and you have the kid during that time you shouldn't have had the kid, and the kid grows up and has some medical problems causing the kid pain. And then somebody comes to you and says, do you regret your choice? And it's such an interesting question, because suppose you were told if you had a child another time, the kid wouldn't have these pains. And you say, yeah, that would have been better. But then this person wouldn't exist.
Exactly. And the
I love this person.
The same test can be applied to people who had children when they were 16 or 17, and on one level deeply regret that and see it as a mistake, but they can never unwish the life of their own child.
Yes, that's right.
Okay, let me give you some quick questions from the audience. Anonymous attendee says, how do we cope with pain and struggles that stem from illness? So this is unchosen pain.
Yeah, this is unchosen.
For example, cancer, i.e. something we've had no control over.
I wrote a summary of my book in the Wall Street Journal, and I got a letter right away from somebody who had chronic pain from cancer. And he was furious at me. She was saying, how dare you say this is one? And I said, no, I'm not. I think those things are awful, and pretending that they're not awful is an insult to people who suffer from these things. I have no bit of special advice. There's the standard issues of psychological treatments, even though it's not a psychological problem. Psychological treatments could help, and physical treatments. And I guess all I could say is don't listen to anybody who says it's happening for a reason.
Fiona says, have you changed how you live your life after doing all your research? This is similar to my sort of wow moment, but in terms of how you actually live your life.
A little bit. I'm going to the gym more. I'm appreciating that these flow states. I'm trying to organize my life so I spend less time on email and Twitter and social media and video games and all of those million things, and more time spending time with my partner or writing or doing other difficult things. And it's hard. It's really hard. But I think I'm making some limited progress. I might always better off as a result.
This is a question that may be beyond your brief, but Karen says, so what's the difference between the value of suffering in fasting that we talked about versus the mindset of an eating disorder?
Oh, that is out of my that is out of my capacity. On the one hand, you might say that they're very different, because certainly an eating disorder is unwanted, but there may be a connection where one argument about what goes on in certain eating disorders is there really is a satisfaction of control, taken to an extreme, taken to an unhealthy extreme. But there's something of controlling what gets into my body to a precise amount, no matter how hungry I am, that feels great. And it connects to almost an obsessive disorder because it holds more value than you would want it to. But I think the notion of control does become valuable in both cases.
Final question, anonymous again. What impact do you think the growth of instant rewarding and passive entertainment, and we did touch on this, will have on us and future generations? So we talked about it very much in a personal context, but do you think that there are going to be big societal changes that perhaps we aren't fully cognizant of at the moment? So you talked about the dangers of looking at our phones. We talked about the passivity of Netflix, not all of it, of course.
Yeah.
Can this is it reshaping our societies?
I think it is. The CEO of Netflix once said, their enemy, they aren't competing with other companies, they're competing with sleep. And I think Facebook and Twitter are competing with life. But, my sons grew up in that world of social media and everything like that. And yet, one of my sons is a rock climber, the other one reads Russian novels for fun. I think people have the resources sometimes to live more of a 19th century life and break out of these temptations. So in the end, I'm kind of an optimist. And I could imagine that if enough people want to break out of the temptations, there could be activities and movements and even technologies that could help them.
Paul, it's been really great to spend the last hour with you, all the way there from Canada to Wales, with people tuning in, no doubt, from America and England and elsewhere. It's been really entertaining, but also important. And there's so much more in the book that we haven't had time to go through. But I feel we scoped it out just a little bit over the course of the last 60 minutes or so. Thank you to everyone as well for coming. So Paul's book, The Sweet Spot, and I hope it hits your sweet spot, is available. Is it available in bookstores in the UK already?
Indeed it is. Indeed it is. They have a different cover. If you look, it has a beautiful cover of a smiley face and a frowny face overlapping.
Yeah,
quite beautiful.
overlapping, exactly. This interesting intersection. The sweet spot, if you get it right, perhaps. And for those of you who've been touched by some of the more serious stuff that on the mental health side, if you're in the UK, you can call 116123. That's a free number. That's the Samaritans. I don't know what the numbers are for Canada, America, and elsewhere, but I'm sure and hope there will be mental health charities that can help. And of course, we talked a little earlier, didn't we, Paul, about the heroism of suffering, but there's nothing heroic about suffering in the mental health context, so please do reach out and talk. But this book is much more about the fun side of life and how, and understanding, as we've talked about, what the psychology is behind our leaning in certain contexts to pain. And to areas that we might find counterintuitive in their relationship to pleasure and happiness. Paul, thank you so much for spending this time with us at How to Academy.
I have to say, we talked before, this has been kind of a flow state for me. The time has whipped by. It was a delight. Thank you so much.
You couldn't have paid me a higher compliment. Thank you. I feel the same.